Good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you are. Welcome to Liberty Lunch. My name is Dan Fishman. I am the Executive Director of the People for Liberty. And we have an exciting show today. Very topical. For those of you who don't know, aren't following the Supreme Court really closely, the Supreme Court had a pretty momentous ruling on Monday. The case was CANIGLIA versus STROM. And the Supreme Court ruled that there can be no warrantless searches by police and seizures in your house. It's a very specific rule. They talk about the fact that your house is different from your car, and they go through a lot of specific things. And it's worth pointing out that this case, if it's in the Supreme Court, it went through several iterations before it got here. Some courts had rejected it, some courts had agreed with it, but the basic premise is that without a warrant, the police can't search your house. So Clarence Thomas wrote in defense of this, the very core of the Fourth Amendment's guarantee is the right of a person to retreat into his or her home and there be free from unreasonable government intrusion. It's a pretty simple thing. A lot of times we don't think about the Fourth Amendment in terms of specifically applying to your home because it says unreasonable searches and seizures, speaking of seizure. However, in this case, we are talking about a very specific ruling that says inside your home, you have a very well-defined, according to the court, right to privacy. Let's go over what the core of the case was. A long-time married, Ed and Kim CANIGLIA, 20 years married. They're arguing as only couples who have been married for 20 years can do. And at one point in time, he brought out a gun, not in a threatening manner, but brought out a gun and said, just shoot me, put me out of my misery. Then he left, sort of upset. She hid the gun, went to spend the night in a hotel. Then she wasn't able to reach him. He had his phone off. She asked the police to come to her house because she wasn't sure what the state of things were, whether or not it was safe or not. She thought he might have harmed himself. And, 20 years. These guys know each other pretty well. The police found the husband on the front porch and talked to him a little bit, concluded that, asking somebody to kill you is at least enough of an indication to say maybe there should be a psychological evaluation. So they sent him for one. The doctors concluded that he was not a threat. He came home. But while he was at the doctor's office, the police came into the house, without any permission, searched it and confiscated his guns and ammunition. And so he sued, alleging an illegal search and seizure of his house, which, it's a pretty straightforward thing. There's no allegation of a crime here, right? The police argued that there's a thing called community safekeeping standard, that in order to keep the community safe, they're authorized to do some things. And in this case, they use that as their excuse to go into the house and search for guns. However, since there had been no case and there'd been no due process, the Supreme Court eventually ruled, no, the police can't do that. There's nothing here that indicates that he's a threat. Now, we're getting into some legal matters. And so if we're going to talk about legal things, my go-to guy is my friend, Nicholas Sarwark. Nick is former chair of the Libertarian Party, but also a former public defender. And so his experience with the law and with due process is something that is going to be really critical to this conversation. So first, let me welcome in Nick Sarwark, also director of the Libertarian Policy Institute.
Good to be with you again, Dan.
Great to have you. I wonder if you can tell people exactly what due process means, how it's guaranteed, and why it's such a critical thing for us to always defend.
So due process in the law, my law professors used to say that the start of due process analysis is what process is due. And I know that sounds like a tautology, but it's what steps have to be taken before the government's action is going to be legitimate. And the amount of process that's due depends on the amount of potential infringement on your liberty and whether or not that liberty is considered in the law to be a core liberty or it's considered to be something that's less important. For example, in the free speech realm, typically the courts strongly protect political speech and weakly protect advertisements in the penny saver. They get a far less protection because they're commercial speech and they're seen as being outside the core of what the thing's about. And that's really what due process analysis starts with, is how serious is this? Now, in this case, CANIGLIA, you've got two very important things in American constitutional law coming together. You have the Second Amendment, the one that maintains the individual's right to keep and bear arms. And you have the Fourth Amendment, which, as you described in the beginning of the show, is about unreasonable searches and seizures. But the Fourth Amendment context sort of has a core, and then it has sort of outer things from the core. The core of the Fourth Amendment has always been the home. Being secure in your own home is the most protected aspect of Fourth Amendment law, of search and seizure law in the United States. And then you go from the home to the curtilage of the home, you know, your porch, your yard, your sidewalk, out to your car, and then you get out to walking down the street, right? And you have very little Fourth Amendment protection walking down the street. There's very little interest in privacy, and you sort of have a maximum amount of Fourth Amendment protection if you're inside your house. You are secure from that in absence of a warrant, or there are certain cabined exceptions, like exigent circumstances, that have historically been seen as an exemption. So if there was suddenly screaming from my house that someone is being hurt, and a police officer is walking down the street and hears the screaming, they would probably be justified in making an entry without a warrant because it was an exigent circumstance. And that's how this whole thing started in CANIGLIA. You've started with someone saying, I'm going to kill myself, the wife getting very upset about that, bringing the police over. And that's where the police kind of lost the plot.
Right.
They're allowed to come in. They're allowed to check on the husband and the wife because of this concern about suicide. And Justice Thomas talks about all of that. These are things police are allowed to do. But Mr. CANIGLIA said, I will agree to go get evaluated at a psychiatric facility to make sure I'm not a danger to myself or others. You don't need to arrest me. You don't need to do all of the things that you might do to do that involuntarily, as long as you agree not to take my guns. I'm going to go to the hospital. You're not going to take my guns. And the police allegedly did so. And then as soon as he was gone, they got his wife to show them where the guns were and took them. And that's how we ended up here.
And so, I appreciate the fact that you brought up the Second Amendment as well, because there are other protections here that are worth mentioning besides the Fourth. When we talk about the idea of a seizure, there are many contentious times that the government gets to act without actually going to a court and allowing a person to defend themselves. And that's one of the elements that people are concerned about here, right? Is that at no point in time did Mr. CANIGLIA get to say, I am in my right state of mind. You have no right to seize my guns. He was never afforded that opportunity.
That's correct. That's the due process problem with the case. And that's the reason that this case came down unanimously against the government. Although it had been dismissed at the trial level in the First Circuit, and the First Circuit had upheld it according to this other case that allows for the community care exception. It's a case called Katie versus, I want to say, Dombrowski, and basically had to do with if we impound a vehicle on the side of the road, the police officers are allowed to check to see if there are any weapons in it as part of the impound process, right? They're cleaning up the road from this impounded vehicle. They get to search it to make sure there's no contraband or dangerous items in it as part of their community care thing.
Right.
And what happened here was either the prosecutors or the whatever government attorney said, oh, there's this community care exception. That must have been what these police officers were doing. They're just caring for the community. And who doesn't want to care for the community? We all care for each other. It's community. I mean, who could dislike that? And the issue is, Katie was a very tightly focused case on vehicle searches, right? Something that's outside the home that is not in its right place. You know, and Katie doesn't allow you to search a vehicle for just at a traffic stop. It only allows you to search a vehicle when that vehicle has to be impounded. Now, in reality, there's often a reason that police officers find an arrestable offense so that then the vehicle has to be impounded so that then they are able to search it. But that is more of a general practice thing for criminal defense people. The upshot of this is that you can't take stuff from someone in their house as a police officer without either a warrant that says, hey, neutral party, this is what I'm trying to get, and this is why I'm justified in getting it. That's the traditional Fourth Amendment way.
Right.
Or some other type of due process. You know, and in one of the concurrences to the decision, I believe it's Justice Alito talks about the fact that we haven't really dealt with the thing next to the thing. Justice Thomas wrote an incredibly tight, incredibly clear opinion that the government can't come into your house and take stuff from you without due process. But red flag laws, thank you, Eric, he's ahead of me.
He is.
Red flag laws are the thing that this is adjacent to, because this is the nice way for the police to come into your house, so to speak. You know, this is them helping deal with someone who's suicidal, preventing them from harming themselves or others. It is the friendliest case you can ever get from the police officer's perspective.
Right.
Red flag laws are different because it's the same type of thing, but now you have an entire process for this is the machinery by which you can go get the police to take something away from someone you don't like, or that you're afraid of, or that you're concerned about. And the due process requirements there are, suffice it to say, unclear how much due process you have to get.
Right. And that's you know, the big objection that I've heard is that a red flag law doesn't have it has judicial review, and that you go before a judge and the case is laid out, but there's no due process because the person whose property is going to be confiscated doesn't get to respond to any of the charges. And so the judge,
not until after.
Right, exactly. They come and they seize your property. And so it's sort of, all right, I'm going to try out a legal term here, and you can tell me if I'm getting it wrong. The judge makes that ruling in absentia, the person who they're ruling against.
Ex parte.
Ex parte. I'm so close.
You're very close. So ex parte is just fancy legal Latin for only one side got to talk to the judge. You know, it's the same reason that prosecutors can indict a ham sandwich. It's because it's a grand jury proceeding where they have one presentation of the evidence and there's never an opportunity for any counter evidence to be presented. Right. Similar warrant applications are ex parte proceedings, by the way. Right. They're the classic example of an ex parte proceeding where law enforcement is telling the judge, this is what I want to do. But they have a very high standard. And the concern that people have about red flag laws is that it's tricky to get a warrant, or it requires work to get a warrant. And you have to create an affidavit, and there's sworn statements, and there are a lot of hurdles to jump through for law enforcement to take things from your house under the warrant requirement. Red flag laws are almost universally, well, let's just make it very plain. Red flag laws confiscate weapons from people who are seen to be a danger, but have not committed a crime. If there was a crime or the immediate or imminent commission of a crime, they would have been able to get your guns because they would have a warrant. Red flag laws are a shortcut to that, where less justification is required than a crime, either in progress or evidence of a crime or instrumentalities of a crime. This is where you can say, that guy gives me a funny feeling. I know he's really well armed. Why don't you go take his guns, and then we'll figure out a couple days from now whether or not it's justified, which is then an entry into a home, which normally requires a warrant. And as we saw in cases like the Duncan Lemp case in Maryland, when you have officers entering a home where they believe that there are guns and someone is dangerous, police have a bad tendency to do dynamic entries to the home, to choose to go into the home at a time and in a circumstance that leads to more death and destruction than they typically take when, for example, executing a warrant on a very dangerous murderer.
Right.
Usually they wait until they're in a quiet place that's not near the home and surprise them in order to avoid the violence. And that's one of the issues in policing in this country that's probably for a different power hour, but that's what's underneath the red. That's the concern that libertarians and other people who support individuals' rights to be secure in their homes and their right to keep and bear arms. Our concern is the how, more so than a direct fight with the idea that there's never a circumstance in which there's a justification to take a gun.
Right.
It's we have to do it the right way. And that's due process, is doing things the right way.
And, you know, it's a very critical point, because some of the things that we talk about there, and I do want to go into that idea of, you know, what's allowable, what the police should be doing. And, you know, we have this terrible example of Breonna Taylor, where, you know, the police have a warrant, but it's the wrong house. And if we consider the circumstances, the question becomes, was it such an imminent threat that it justified entering the house in the first place? And that's one of the things that I'm hearing a lot of talk about at this point in time too, is that there's a question as to whether or not the police need to enter a person's home, even for an arrest warrant, when they could just as easily arrest them outside in the public and not violate the sanctity of the home.
There are, and you know, if there are law enforcement people who feel that there are other examples that I'm not remembering, I'm happy to hear their feedback. But in all of the cases that I've seen, and I practiced as a public defender for 5 years in Colorado. I tried 36 cases to a jury, including first-degree murder. I dealt with the law of self-defense and many, many warrant applications and affidavits that were challenged in court. Tactically, there are very few circumstances that justify dynamic entry into a home. Dynamic entry is the nice way to say they bust your door down, often in the middle of the night, and surprise.
I've never heard that phrase before, but it's awesome.
It's used in the law enforcement community, and so I try and use the terms that they would use when talking about what they're talking about, so that other people know what that means. A dynamic entry is where you come in without being wanted to come in. And they're very seldom necessary. It was developed for the racist war on drugs, and under the theory that if your evidence or instrumentality of the crime is going to be destroyed, that you need to surprise the person in order to collect the evidence.
Right.
Now, that theory is tenuous at best, but let's say that it even does apply to drug cases. Let's give them the benefit of that doubt, that literally the bag of cocaine is hovering over the toilet bowl, ready to be dropped as soon as they hear a knock on the door.
Right.
They still use the tactics in a lot of non-drug cases.
Yep.
And as far as revealed preference for police officers, what you see is that they do dynamic entries for relatively low-level things because it allows them to go into a house and surprise people, potentially see things in plain view that would allow them to have other charges. And it also lets them practice tactics and techniques and use the toys that they've gotten from the military, because we've changed how policing works in this country in ways that are not productive for a peaceful society. When officers are dealing with actual violent criminals, people who are suspected of or are known to have killed other people, people who are on the run from murdering a police officer or, you know, violent gang members, typically law enforcement will not execute those warrants through dynamic entry. They will not execute those warrants anywhere around the person's home. They will wait and wait and wait until they put themselves into a vulnerable position where you can execute the warrant and arrest the subject without the danger to law enforcement. And that's really the key to it. If we want to get things to be better, and that's what we're focused on at the Libertarian Policy Institute, is providing the peaceful tools for people to make their world better. One of those peaceful tools is eliminating dynamic entry, is no longer doing this without perhaps making there be a special warrant, or just eliminating it entirely, or make there be a hearing about it, because it goes wrong too often for it to be right.
And so you raise an excellent point in terms of thinking about, what the people want, what the police want, and then what's safe. And is there any sort of movement at the legislation level? I mean, you talked about the Libertarian Policy Institute talking about this. Is anybody getting close to saying that dynamic entry is something that should be reviewed? Because certainly there's plenty of examples, and these are obviously very auspicious examples, but Waco, Ruby Ridge, Bundy Ranch, and all those places, the police said, you know what? Maybe we don't want to go running in there. Or I guess in Waco, they tried it the wrong way first.
Yeah, I think those are great illustrations of the fact that when there is perceived to be an actual threat to officer safety, they do not do dynamic entry. They do either siege, or they lie in wait, or they do sneaky things where they catch them walking into a restaurant. They do stuff in order to protect everyone.
Right.
It's where they perceive lower danger to officers, where they have a sense of overwhelming force. Right. If you go in the middle of the night with 10 guys and you bust a door down, you have both surprise and, in most cases, superior weapons and tactics.
Yep.
Right. And so you're looking at it from the perspective of a war zone, where you use surprise and superior weapons and tactics in order to kill other people. You can't take that tactic that's used in a war zone in order to overwhelm an enemy and potentially kill them, and apply it to peacekeeping in the United States and maintain the fiction that law enforcement is really part of the community. They are demonstrating through actions that they are choosing not to be on partnership terms. They're choosing to be on adversarial terms with the community that they're charged to protect. There are movements in this direction because of the tragedies that we've seen, especially in Kentucky with Breonna Taylor, to push back against no-knock warrants, which are the most egregious part of the dynamic entry spectrum, where you literally provide no warning and you just bust down a door and hope to surprise people. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. What we really need to look at is, why are we doing any dynamic entries? Why are we not doing knock and announce? And why aren't we doing things that require actual investigation for law enforcement? If you can't build a case without surprising a person in their home, your case is not that strong. Right. And what we need to remember, and this is critical, the Fourth Amendment is not intended to make it easy to prosecute crime. And I'm going to say it again. It is not intended to make it easy to prosecute crime. If you want to make it easy to prosecute crime, you implement a Chinese system of police surveillance and a police state where police officers can go anywhere they want at any time to do anything in order to root out crime. And we built this country, our forefathers built this country, the founders built this country on the idea that that level of state power was unbalanced, and that individuals should have a level of security and sovereignty that would at times thwart the goals of the government. We have an essentially subversive state, and it's built into the DNA of our country, that the government is not in charge totally. It's only in charge in so much as it has the generalized consensus of the community, or the consent of the governed. I think some old white guy
wrote somewhere, it's one of those critical things that, it really bothers me, and I'm not sure where the talk has come, but people often will say now, and you especially hear this in the younger generation, oh, my rights are given to me by the Constitution. when of course, in fact, the Constitution is a specific instruction saying rights are not given to you. They are yours inherently. We might argue inalienably. And that the Constitution's instructions to the Congress, to the government, to not interfere with those rights. So if we go back and we talk about the Fourth Amendment, and one of the best things that I've heard, just follow up on your thing, is that, you know, the police would make a lot more convictions if it weren't for those pesky warrant requirements. The reality of it is that the protection for you from unreasonable search and seizure. I'm going to get that backwards the rest of the day.
They can't take your stuff.
Well, exactly. Right. They can't take your stuff, but more than that, they can't observe you in the places where you have a reasonable expectation of privacy. And so there've been a couple other cases of where police have used heat guns to say, oh, somebody's growing marijuana in there because we see the house is very hot, or where they've used illegal wiretaps because people have an expectation of privacy. And the court's been pretty clear about those things, that those are also illegal searches because they're observing you.
Right. And what it acknowledges is that there are more crimes that exist in the world. There are more things being done behind closed doors than we know about.
Right.
And you can't get all of those things. You can't necessarily get to the point where you stop all crime. And we need to return back to the roots of our country. And I very seldom say we need to return back to roots, because it has sort of a reactionary disposition that I'm not super fond of. I want to move forward. So maybe what I should say is we want to move forward to a place that's similar to when the country was founded, where we had a limited amount of criminal laws. When most things you did, if you didn't interfere with the life or liberty of another person, were not illegal.
Right.
Then they might be stupid. They might be something we don't like. You might get all your neighbors like yelling at you about it, but we wouldn't take that step to make it a thing with the criminal law where your liberty or your life could be taken away for doing them.
Well, and that comes into an interesting sort of sub conversation. It's been said that if you try to tell Americans that they need to work to be free, most Americans will say, well, I'm already free, because they don't really understand what we're trying to describe as the liberty lifestyle. And the liberty lifestyle is that in your lifestyle, you expect that if you want to put a shed up in your backyard, you'll put a shed up in your backyard. If you want to brew alcohol, you'll brew alcohol. The government isn't required for you to do any of those things. And one of the great things that I think about the Fourth Amendment is that there's an implication there that if whatever you're doing is so minimal that we can't see you doing it, you're not affecting anybody else, then it's probably not too illegal, and we shouldn't be concerned about that. I mean, in many ways, it's very prescient.
It's also excellent advice for people who are interacting with each other on social media or the internet. You know, there are the Facebook does very few things that I'm super happy about, but one of them is the snooze for 30 days. I'm sure that there are friends of mine who are talking about the conflict between Israel and Hamas, that saying things that I would be disappointed in them if I read them. And the snooze for 30 days means if I don't know that they're doing them, then for me, they're not. And that is a superpower. The ability to not care if other people do stupid things or things that you disapprove of allows you to flow through the world with putting in less of your energy into things that aren't really core to why you're here on the planet. What is your purpose in life? It's not to argue with strangers on the internet. And similarly, the purpose of American society, the purpose of building a country that's built on the idea of shared values rather than shared blood or shared soil, rather than ethnicity or class. It's built on the idea that if you all agree to live peacefully under these principles, you are one of us. You can become one of us. That philosophy lends itself to the idea that for the most part, unless you're violating that, we don't bother with what you do because we aren't strong enough to tell you you're definitely right or you're definitely wrong, right? There's a humility built into America that it is ecumenical as far as there are no religious tests for office. It does allow, after we got past the Civil War, for freedom of equal protection for everybody, regardless of social class or race or sex, things like that. So the criminal law takes us into that direction of let's watch everybody and make sure nobody's doing anything bad. And where that usually comes from in personal life and may come from in governmental life is things get better and there's less work to do. So you get bored. And when you're bored, being a nosy neighbor, being a Mrs. Kravitz, even if you're a Mrs. Kravitz in a blue uniform with a gun, is one way to fill the boredom. And so maybe we need to look at what productive things can we be spending our time and effort on so that we no longer are interested in what's going on behind the closed doors of my neighbor's house.
Right. For the millennials, Mrs. Kravitz was a nosy neighbor who got involved in other people's stuff. I've been culling some of my older television references recently. To that end, one of the things too that is intrinsic in that idea of you can be one of us is that one of us only means that we tolerate everybody else doing anything that doesn't hurt us, that doesn't take our stuff. And tolerance is really it's the one critical word. And it's so misused because a lot of times you will hear, for example, just the other day, I heard one of the squad talking about, we need more tolerance in the United States. But I happen to know that person isn't tolerant of the idea that people should be able to own guns personally. And so they have selective tolerance. And in many ways, that hurts us. That hurts the idea of tolerance in general, because it says, well, tolerance does allow you to be intolerant of some things, when in reality, tolerance isn't tolerating people doing things that you like. It's specifically tolerating them doing things that you don't approve of, but you agree that you don't have a right to stop them from doing it.
Right. I mean, so we tolerate all sorts of terrible things that happen in the world. We tolerate hunger. We tolerate homelessness. We tolerate, the Saudi bombing of Yemen. We tolerate all of these things. And that's kind of the distinction, right? As Americans, we should fight back against our tax dollars being used to bomb innocents in Yemen or bomb innocents in Gaza. We should fight back on foreign aid being used to do things that are not aligned with the values of a supermajority of Americans, right? Because America is an experiment about having people who have very different views on all of the things that nations were traditionally structured around: ethnicity, religion, race. We tolerate all of those different views if you can abide by a very small subset of values, and makes it a much more dynamic place. Yep. We tolerate that there are other countries that are going to do bad things, or that there are other people who are going to make bad choices. But that just means we allow them to exist. It doesn't mean we're required to help them. Right. And if it is in fact an injustice or something cruel and terrible, our tolerance can be tempered by speaking out. And that's where libertarians have a better way to approach the problems that really bring conflict in society.
Right.
Because we start from the premise that we persuade, we speak out, we use social pressure, we use our right to control our associations and how we spend our dollars and how we spend our votes to influence other people. Right. Without ever forcing them. They could be recalcitrant.
Persuasion versus coercion.
Always persuasion before coercion, because coercion is it's giving up. You're giving up.
One of my favorite quotes is Isaac Asimov said, "Violence is the last refuge of the incompetent." If you get to the point that you have to use force, you've essentially admitted, I can't do anything else because I'm not capable of finding these I'm not capable of finding a rational solution to it. So I want to come back to the Supreme Court case and wrap things up a little bit. Would you like to talk a little bit about what the Libertarian Policy Institute is doing? Any place if people want to go to find out more about what you guys are up to?
Yeah, so the Libertarian Policy Institute, as you know, started late 2019,
Yep.
but got sidelined and wasn't super active because there were a lot of other things going on in 2020.
I heard there was a pandemic.
Here and there. Huh?
I heard there was a pandemic.
There was. And so we published various policy recommendations and proposals that people could take into their community or go talk to their elected officials about, or just take as a way to live their own life and make the world better over that course. And if you visit libertarianpolicy.org, we have a lot of great articles. There's a nice dovetailed set of a libertarian approach to COVID-19 from April of 2020, right at the beginning of the pandemic, and then a libertarian path forward from COVID-19 that came out in April of this year. As we're at least at the end of the beginning. We can see where we're going from here, and how do we come back together as a country after the amount of tensions and friction that have been created in our society. What I haven't talked a lot about is we've been working with bringing on more people. Richard Manzo has joined the Libertarian Policy Institute to do operations as operations director, so that we can be more effective and efficient and share some of that burden of the work. And we have a website relaunch and rebrand that's probably going to come out within the week. It's been a long time coming, and it's important to get it right because things are changing in this country. And I think the old alignments, honestly, I think anything that you believed about politics before 2020 needs to be checked. I was just reading Thich Nhat Hanh's Anger on the advice of a friend, and there's a anecdote he talks about where in hospitals they have signs up that say, "Are you sure? Are you sure?"
Interesting.
And it's to avoid medical errors, that you think that you got things right, you think that you did it right, but double check before you go. It's the same thing they tell you in carpentry: measure twice and cut once. You're not sure until you're sure. And I think that our understanding of American political science and what the country needs or wants needs a lot of that. Are we sure? Are we sure that this side is better than that side? Are we sure that this party still holds these values? Are we sure that this is really what people want? Or is this just us falling into a pattern that we're very familiar with?
That's a really strong point, because being sure means taking the time to think. And there's been so much knee-jerk reaction that if people really take the time to think about what's happening in the country, I think we'll be in a better spot. You know, I wanted to give a plug to one of the things that People for Liberty is doing right now. peopleforliberty.org/legislation. There is so much legislation going on right now that affects liberty one way or the other. Most of it, sadly, is restricting liberty. There's some things that some people are trying to keep some of the liberty gains that we made right now. And it's a great place for anybody who wants to get involved in some activism. Go to peopleforliberty.org/legislation, and we have a list of, and we have the ability for you to add to that as well. Anything that's going on, anything where you might be able to testify at your school board or at a public meeting or at your state house. peopleforliberty.org/legislation. People who are elected need to know that the liberty voice is out there, and we're advocating for that.
And that's, can I just dovetail on that? Because
Please.
Our philosophies are pretty similar on this.
Yes.
One of the things that I think we both had a lot of experience with is people get excited about wanting to change the world.
Right.
And they want to get engaged. And what many people in the libertarian sphere have done in the past is say, well, go say these things louder so more people can hear you, so we'll wake more people up. But there's not concrete action that changes the world. You know, there are actions that you can take that actually make the world better, where you have an impact, you make a difference. And so providing people the tools to go do something before the government moves, right? Calling about legislation is excellent. And it's an excellent volunteer thing to do where you have been able to influence the direction of the world. Where we want to take it farther at LPI is start looking at non-governmental ways to solve some of these problems that don't require you to go lobby a legislator. I was talking to an organization that is interested in housing rights and how do we improve housing for people and how do we not make landlords and tenants antagonists, but how do we have them work together in order to make sure that everyone has a place to live and those who want to own the place where they live are able to do so. And,
that's incredibly
That's
meaningful.
what I mean about, are you sure?
Yeah.
Are you sure that landlords and tenants are on the opposite side? Are you sure that the Israelis and Palestinians are on the opposite side? Are you sure that the Republicans and Democrats are on the opposite side? And I think that's something we pointed out when the opportunity arises, that oftentimes they are on the same side. It may be the wrong one. Maybe the people are actually on the opposite side from them. And so maybe the people should say, hey, we're all on this side. Those guys are over there. How about we just fix the problem and then we'll let the government know how we fixed it so that their services are no longer needed.
It's an incredibly meaningful thing and would love to see it happen. I know two immediate things that Republicans and Democrats agree upon, and that's me and you. So it's a pretty straightforward thing. My guest today has been Nicholas Sarwark, head of the Libertarian Policy Institute, recent candidate for county attorney in Hillsborough, New Hampshire, former chair of the Libertarian National Committee. If I were to read your whole resume, it'd be too long. Nick, it's always wonderful to have you on. Thank you so much for being on the Liberty Lunch Power Hour.
Thank you so much for having me, Dan. I'm always happy to join you. Outstanding.
And for everybody else, please follow us, peopleforliberty.org. We look forward to, we're sending out our next newsletter next week. So if you're to sign up now, you'd get it next week. That would be exciting, right?